Constructive Voices, the podcast for the construction people, with news, views, and expert interviews.
Hello, I'm Steve Randall. Welcome to Constructive Voices as we continue building our conversation about biodiversity.
BNG, Biodiversity Net Gain, is a really positive step. Whether 10% does enough, I suspect 10% improvement through development stops the rot, so it stops further degradation. But actually, it's only when we get to sort of 20-30% biodiversity net gain that we can start to see some reversal of some of the damage that we've done, in the last 200-300 years.
That's sustainability lawyer Ben Stansfield. We'll be meeting him shortly.
Constructive Voices media partner in Ireland and the United Kingdom is Construction Industry News. Since 2002, Construction Industry News has been focused on the very latest projects and developments within the UK and Ireland.
Now, normally on Constructive Voices, I'm joined by Peter Finn, Pete the Builder, but he's busy with a secret project, which maybe we'll find out about on the next episode. But we do have a fantastic guest. Ben Stansfield is a sustainability lawyer, and we're going to be talking about the uncertainty in the industry about the upcoming BNG laws, which are being introduced in the UK and quite likely will be rolled out elsewhere in the following months and years to come. Ben talks about the appetite and willingness to come on board within the industry, but also says that more information and adjustment time is required. Overall, he believes the future is brighter for nature recovery if the laws work as they appear they will. So let's meet Ben. He's been talking to Jackie de Burka.
My name's Ben. I am half planning lawyer, half environmental lawyer, so I spend a lot of my time getting consents and approvals for clients wishing to undertake sort of energy infrastructure and large projects, and creating and establishing new sustainable communities. And then the rest of my time I spend sort of doing projects like sort of biodiversity, landscape recovery, and dealing with emissions to air, to water, to contamination and so forth. I've been doing this for about 22 years now.
I'm going to read you a quote. "We're in a biodiversity crisis, and biodiversity net gain is such an important policy in stopping the destruction of habitats and ecosystems." Does that sound familiar to you?
It does. Someone very intelligent.
I borrowed it from one of your LinkedIn posts. I thought it was excellent and very, very much on point. Talk to me a little bit about your feelings about this.
Let's go back 10,000 years. We were 60% forests, 40% grasslands. And then we learned how to farm and we learned how to develop. And you can kind of see that, in the last, since 5,000 years ago when we first started farming, we started changing the environment and habitats which we lived. And so now we're at the point where we've lost 1/3 of our forests. We've lost 3/4 of our grassland and shrubs. And we've replaced that with the built environment, which is actually only about 1% globally, and the remaining 45% of our land is used for agricultural purposes. So it's a lot of monoculture, grazing land for livestock and obviously growing crops for human consumption as well. So BNG, Biodiversity Net Gain, is a really positive step. Whether 10% does enough, I suspect 10% improvement through development stops the rot, so it stops further degradation. But actually, it's only when we get to sort of 20-30% biodiversity net gain that we can start to see some reversal of some of the damage that we've done, in the last 200-300 years.
So possibly before you were alive, back in 1973, badgers became somewhat protected and the law was weak, but it was actually updated later in 1992. Since then, and coming up to 2021, can you give us a brief synopsis of environmental laws that would be pertinent to the built environment?
Crumbs, that's an exam question. We've had environmental laws in the UK and England and Wales, since the Industrial Revolution with, smoke acts and all this kind of stuff. So, being in a densely populated island, I think has been very positive for environmental law compared to some parts of the world where, space hasn't been such an issue. But I kind of think that environmental law really came of age, I guess. Well, it's certainly in the UK. I guess in Europe, we had all sorts of framework directives in the 70s and 80s. But I think it really got into top gear around sort of 2000, 2001 when we introduced new legislation around liability for contaminated land. And that suddenly put environmental law and liability on the on the boardroom agenda. So when people were buying businesses, were buying sites and what have you, there was potential that they might take a liability for environmental harms that they hadn't caused. And so all of a sudden, there was sort of this dramatic growth in environmental law because people were suddenly very concerned about it at a top level. And I guess since then, environmental law and liabilities have sort of ebbed and flowed a little bit. And we've, we had emissions trading, and then environmental lawyers became energy lawyers and what have you. So it's moved around a bit. We've had nature preservation and protection laws for some time, but my sense is that interest in preserving and enhancing nature has only really come about probably in the last 2 or 3 years. It's sort of we've been focusing on net zero and decarbonisation and carbon dioxide for a long time. It's only, I guess, in the past couple of years, as I say, that nature and biodiversity are starting to become top table issues.
Why do you think that is, Ben, out of curiosity?
I mean, I guess it's partly driven by the sort of the ESG movement that, a lot of people are looking at businesses more holistically in terms of looking what their impact are, and businesses are wanting to tell a good story to their stakeholders. And I think when businesses and large organizations say, we're going to go net zero by 2030 or 2040 or 2050, if you drill down, it's a bit of a difficult message to sell, because you're saying, I'm going to stop polluting in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. I'm going to turn off my carbon taps in future. Whereas enhancing biodiversity, restoring nature, looking at your impact on the natural world, that's something you can do tomorrow. And that's a really positive story to tell your customers, to your employees, to your shareholders and what have you. So I think the immediacy of nature is quite attractive for big business.
Would you think COVID had anything to do with it at all because of the experiences people had?
People getting out in nature every day and clear skies and so forth, I'm sure that plays a big part of it. Yeah, it likely does. But I think, we were talking about sustainability for a little while before COVID, but I think, I guess we've come back to the office, as it were, since then and really focused on the world in which we live in.
I guess a lot of people living in the UK would agree that, many, many significant changes of recent years can be linked to Brexit. So moving away from COVID for a second, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And the Environmental Act of 2021, it probably falls into that because, of course, that was due to Brexit, wasn't it?
It's certainly got provisions within it which respond to Brexit. So one of the tasks that the European Commission did very effectively was to take member state governments to task when they failed to keep to their environmental targets and failed to comply and implement environmental laws properly. So one of the big pillars, I guess, of the Environment Act was to establish the Office for Environmental Protection, the OEP. So whose role is a little bit like the European Commission was, to keep an eye on government, make sure that it's doing what it said it would do, and take public bodies to task if they don't. So that was a post-Brexit mechanism. But the Environment Act does a lot more than that. Biodiversity net gain is, again, another big plank of the Environment Act. That's not a Brexit solution, or that wasn't a Brexit problem that we needed to fix. That was something else.
So as a framework law, Ben, the Act is only a foundation, and obviously it's going to rely on further targets and policies and more detailed rules that are right now still to be developed. Isn't that the case?
Yes, that's right. So a lot of our law comes, yes, we have the framework legislation, but all the detail will come in secondary legislation. So we talk about, the Environment Act is primary legislation, but then we've got these orders and regulations which have a lot of the detail within them, and then associated with that guidance, statutory guidance and what have you as well. So yeah, a lot of the detail will come subsequently in the secondary legislation.
When the details and the devil is in the details, as we all know, come, these will have to be strong enough and very effectively enforced to protect people's health and the environment, really for the Act to fulfill its full purpose. How do you feel this will affect both your legal practice and also some of the clients you're currently dealing with?
I can genuinely look everyone who I meet in the eye and say that none of my clients, and I've certainly in 22 years never felt that any of my clients are trying to do the wrong thing. Occasionally they get caught up, they might misinterpret a regulation, they might not know about it, but I don't know of anyone who is really trying to pull a fast one and cause environmental degradation with intent. Now, I may be lucky, but I think my sense is that most environmental lawyers might feel like that. So I don't think this will, new duties, new rules, and what have you, will make them change their ways. I think it's sort of an education process. It's just there is more regulation, there is more obligations, more requirements for them to take account of. So I don't see the Environment Act as sort of something that my clients will be fearing. I think they just will have to spend time getting their heads around it and understanding the tighter regime that they might now be subject to. And the more creative will be thinking, well, how can we develop new business models? How can we change our business to benefit and have a competitive advantage in this sort of new or developing world of tighter regulation?
Looking at your profile on LinkedIn and all of the research I've done prior to our chat today, you're obviously very hopeful and optimistic about what could be achieved. What do you feel, Ben, are the biggest opportunities for biodiversity net gain in the UK?
I am. It is difficult to be sort of glass half full all the time, and I'm always very conscious that sometimes I get a bit Eeyore-ish about this and what have you. But I think my overall sense is it's a real privilege to be working in this sector at the moment because, as a society and as a bunch of professionals, we'll either fix this or stuff it up in the next 10, 15, 25 years. So to be a part of that community trying to fix it and create long-term environmental hope, I think there's never been a better time to be working in the environmental field. And I think in relation to biodiversity, this is probably the first major policy in England which is trying to establish a nature market. It's a discussion for people far more intelligent and articulate than me as to whether we should be putting a price on nature and getting business, which arguably has been the cause of some of the degradation of the natural world, whether we should be entrusting business to fix it. But, we are where we are. And I think there's a massive interest in nature, improving biodiversity, in establishing nature markets, getting business involved with fixing that problem. So I think it is tremendously exciting at the moment.
Talking about nature markets, which I definitely want to talk about it in more detail a little bit later on, Ben. Just going back to, let's say, I don't know your clients obviously, but let's say it's a developer, for example. The Act, when it comes fully into effect, it's going to potentially create a radical shift in the approach to development, both rurally and, in an urban setting. Specifically to that, Ben, what are your hopes and predictions around that?
The way the biodiversity net gain regime has been set up is that there are a number of ways in which you can improve your biodiversity. You can do it on site, whether that's sort of within the grounds of your building or on the building, or you can do it off site. You can buy units from third parties who are creating biodiversity units for sale, or you can buy credits from the Secretary of State. So there's a number of different ways you can satisfy your obligation. But I really hope that developers look at the thrust of the rules and say, okay, this isn't a matter of paying or buying our way out of trouble, buying some credits so that we can do an offset. I really hope that's not the mentality. I really want this to trigger a shift in terms of how we design our built environment and how we incorporate nature and biodiversity into the way in which we live. And absolutely, there's some fantastic ways to improve biodiversity with offsite, and I think that that absolutely got its place. But I hope that we can look at how we can sort of bring green into our urban spaces much more.
It's such a remarkable time in our history, Ben. And Jane Findlay, who's the immediate past president of the Landscape Institute, she did a few episodes before yours, and she will be involved in the training that we're making around BNG. And she is fabulous talking about the link between our own health and obviously biodiversity and nature. And it's just such a massive and a fascinating topic that alone, you'd imagine, should be just enough to win the case for people like you and I.
Yeah. No, I entirely agree.
Have you looked at BNG in other countries? If so, how do you feel our ambitions in the UK compared to other countries?
We have looked to see if there are other countries who are adopting similar rules. I'm sure listeners will go, well, if he doesn't mention this particular country, then he doesn't know what he's talking about. I don't think there are many. I'm going to be even bolder. I don't think there are any systems quite like this. There are other countries. I think Australia was looking at something similar recently, and I know that the EU is looking closely at how this works in England. It's quite nice to think of this might be one of our big Brexit successes, actually, that we can transfer, environmental legislation sort of back across the channel. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of eyes on this to see how successful it will be.
It is a nice position to be in, particularly if people run with it in the way that you feel optimistic and hopeful about, What about nature recovery strategies? Are they a further burden for the local authorities, do you think? Or are they something that's really integral to all of this, working together properly?
Interesting one. So I think there is likely to be a bit of a disconnect between the nature recovery strategies and BNG, with perhaps I seem to recall that the nature recovery strategies are more of a county council issue rather than a local planning authority, municipality issue. So I think there's a real opportunity to join the two and to think about how particularly off-site BNG solutions can be incorporated and supplement and enhance and all that kind of stuff, nature recovery strategies. But I do fear that left hand doesn't speak to right hand. So I hope I'm wrong, but I think there needs to be, for it to really succeed and take off, there will need to be better relationships between county and LPA.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I agree with that. Now, let's just veer away from sort of like, your own opinion and possibilities as to the outcomes of when the law is fully enforced and so on, in a positive sense. Putting your legal eagles hat on, what do you feel, Ben, are just going through different people within built environment? What do you feel are going to be the potential legal pitfalls if you're dealing with a small developer?
Biodiversity net gain has been delayed for smaller developments, so up to 9 residential units, or I think it's 1,000 square meters of commercial space, and until some point next year. So they will have an advantage in that they will be able to sort of stand to the side and watch the larger schemes and see how that all washes out. And I think a lot of the issues here will be around discussions with planning officers as to where biodiversity is to be delivered. Is it going to be on site, or can they go to an off-site solution? I think the real legal issue around biodiversity net gain is what the agreements which will be used to secure the delivery and maintenance for 30 years of the biodiversity works will say. I've got my own views as to how onerous those obligations are likely to be, but we're waiting or hoping that DEFRA and government will give us some model, if not model clauses, but some ideas as to how rigorous they expect the agreements to be, because these are going to be really onerous, as they rightly should be. Okay, to protect nature and ensure that the uplifts are properly delivered over 30 years. And I think that for smaller developers, they will be perhaps a difficult thing to get their heads around, and there will potentially be a reluctance, whether large or small developers, to put those conservation covenants and Section 106 obligations on their land, on their developments. That raises all sorts of questions in terms of who's going to be responsible for the maintenance, the monitoring for 30 years. How do we ensure there's enough funding available? How do we ensure that the biodiversity is replanted, for example, when we have a terrible storm in year 11, all that kind of stuff? So I think I think that's probably applicable to all developers, but small in particular will find that tricky.
I think it is tricky. Obviously, it's tricky. And that's one of the subjects that has come up with Claire Wansbury when we're making plans around podcasts and training and so on, that, the law and the fallout from the law, the positive, possibilities from the law, that's all very nice. But who's going to maintain it? Who are the caretakers here?
Yeah, exactly. And that needs to be addressed in these conservation covenants, and it needs to be done to the satisfaction, essentially, of the local planning authority, who are going to be signing off a biodiversity gain plan before a developer can start works. And I suspect that those biodiversity game plans and therefore the underlying conservation covenants and what have you will be really closely scrutinised by objectors. It just introduces a whole new layer of risk for the development industry as to when they can have the certainty that their developments can proceed.
And then the next question, I guess, Ben, would be, I know it's hard to think about right now because there's enough to take on board, I suppose, at the moment, but, what happens at the end of the 30 years? They're looking at the landowners, re-agreeing to similar terms. How's that going to work, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think we're seeing some landowners who are reluctant to enter into these obligations for 30 years, and so would rather transfer their land to a developer and say, look, you just buy it from me and it's your problem in 30 years' time. Because it's kind of hard, isn't it, to envisage that after 30 years you're going to be able to do anything with that land other than continue a biodiverse use. It's not like you're going to be able to take out that habitat and build something. I just don't think that's likely. So the guidance, or rather the government's response to its consultation, say, well, we're alive to this, and what we can do instead is you could re-baseline your site in 30 years' time, or at the end of these covenants, and you could do some additional improvements, and you can create more biodiversity units and sell those as well. And that's almost analogous to the renewable energy industry, where onshore wind farm developers would repower their schemes. So they take out the old turbines and put new modern ones in, which are more efficient, larger capacity, all that kind of stuff. And so I think we will see, a sort of a repowering of biodiversity gain sites in 30 years' time. But my sense is that once land is in the BNG regime, it's going to be very difficult to take it out.
Sure. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now, obviously, apart from what we've just discussed, are there any other sort of pitfalls that you think the larger developers are going to be aware of at this time?
There's still very significant uncertainty as to the nuts and bolts of the regime. And that is causing frustration, particularly for developers of large schemes which will be delivered in phases. So you might have a sort of a large housing estate which is built as 3 or 4 phases and what have you. Might require lots of infrastructure up front, and I think there's an anxiety that local planning officers will require too much of the biodiversity net gain works to be delivered up front. So I think this will all wash out and we'll all get completely comfortable with it in 2 or 3 years' time. Everyone will know what market practice is, and it will be a success. It has to be a success. But I think government is nervous to avoid a bit like we had with feed-in tariffs. Do you remember when we had the ground-mounted solar and roof-mounted solar projects, and feed-in tariffs were too generous, and the rules had to be changed. They were changed on an almost weekly or monthly basis, and we really don't want to go through that again. This is the biggest thing to happen, I think, to the development industry in years. So it's got to be right, and they've got to get it right first time. Inherently, they need the flexibility to change it if it isn't. But I just think they want this certainty, the regulatory certainty, so everyone knows what the rules are. And so I think there's a lot of information still missing, which is, I'd rather have the right information than have them rush it. But I think we don't know what irreplaceable habitat means. We don't know what the biodiversity game plan needs to contain. We don't know what the regulations, which will really put the nuts and bolts around this framework, what they look like, and whether they'll be issued for consultation or whether they'll simply be made. So I think there are, without wishing to get Rumsfeldian, there are things we don't know, and things we know we don't know, but there will be traps that we haven't even yet thought of.
If you've got a client who's an ecologist who's working on behalf of their own client, obviously, they need advice on BNG. Now, taking into account that you've already identified that there are a large number of unknowns,
Yep.
But what sort of direction would you be taking? What would you be looking out for with that client?
So I think what's really important where there is regulatory uncertainty as an advisor is to be saying the same thing to your clients, irrespective of who they are. So if I'm advising a local planning authority, I should be saying to them the same thing as I am to developers. And we've got planning is often confrontational and combative, and it's officers thinking that developers are trying to pull a fast one, and developers thinking that planning officers are trying to cause delay and don't understand and all this kind of stuff. And I think for something which has such fundamentally important aims as BNG does, forget who our client, our real client, nature. And I know that sounds, very sort of tree huggery and all this kind of stuff. But
But
actually, I think
it's the truth right
yeah,
now, because without it we're not doing very well.
exactly right. So I think I would like to think that I would be giving the same advice on the regime to ecologists, to developers, to planning officers, and I think it has to be a really collaborative approach between us all as to what a robust solution looks like. And we won't have all the answers, and there will be gaps in conservation covenants, and there will be assumptions made in biodiversity baselines, and no one really knows how it's going to work. But let's just do something that's robust, that's fair, that's justifiable and defensible. And yeah, it might not be 100% right, but it's going to be good enough.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think my advice to my fellow professionals, or ecologists, or officers, or other lawyers is kind of to forget what side you're on. Just think about what gives the best results for nature within a commercial context, obviously.
Sure. Okay. Now, obviously, BNG is going to be applied also to nationally significant infrastructure projects.
Mm.
Any different perspectives here? Because I imagine, this is just a bigger version, obviously a hugely bigger version of what you've just said. But is there anything else that you would like to say about it?
Yeah, no, you're right. It's the infrastructure planning regime will be subject to BNG, and it'll be sort of like town and country planning BNG, but on steroids. The sites will be just much bigger. The impacts could be, the long and thin projects, whether it's a road, a rail, or something like that, a pipeline. That's going to make assessment more tricky. There's going to need to be land take potentially, so potentially compulsory acquisition of land in order to deliver biodiversity gain, which is going to be really controversial, because typically, obviously, compulsory acquisition is for acquiring land that's absolutely necessary for that project and there's no alternative and all that kind of stuff. So I suspect there'll be greater use of compulsory purchase powers for that, I think, and that will be controversial. I think typically a lot of large infrastructure projects might have a marine element, so there'll be a marine net gain is another discussion. But yeah, I think we will see all these issues come to the fore, and in sort of greater concentrations than we do with town and country planning. But it's from November 25, so again we'll have that learning from the town and country planning regime that we can take into NSIPs, and hopefully we'll hit the infrastructure biodiversity net gain with a bit more confidence and a bit more understanding as to what's really going to happen.
Absolutely. Now, Ben, we touched on a little while ago nature markets. Would you like to talk about the link between nature markets and BNG law? I know you did make a statement, and I don't disagree with that either. The idea of the commercial world, being kind of dragged into this. You have your doubts about it. I don't know, is there any avoiding it? Because I actually understand what you're saying. But let's talk about the link and how it could work if it goes positively.
Yeah, so I think the government has estimated or set a target that it wants to get, I think it's something like £500 million worth of investment into nature in England and Wales, or the UK, by the sort of mid to late 20s, and I think up to £1 billion worth of investment by 2030. And so, quite rightly, it says, where does that money come from? And it can only really come from the commercial world, from financiers, investors, developers, and so forth. So the concept of the nature markets is to require business, well, maybe not require, maybe sometimes it doesn't, maybe it's done on a voluntary basis, but to essentially make our nature produce something that people want to buy. So here we've got, for biodiversity net gain, that's a nature market. It's saying developers are under a requirement to do something, to either generate or purchase their own biodiversity gain units or credits from the Secretary of State. And how are those created? Well, they're created by people doing things with land that improves biodiversity, that can be accurately assessed and valued and sold. And so we're seeing it with biodiversity net gain, we're seeing it with carbon sequestration in woodlands and peatlands, we've seen it with nutrient neutrality for a little while, which hasn't quite been a wild west, but it certainly hasn't been as closely regulated as biodiversity net gain will be. So I think, I do think business is the right body, broad body in industry to do this. I think it's probably the only solution as well. So I think it's and as I say, every business that I've come across wants to improve its nature, its footprint and impact on the natural world. So I just think we just need to really make sure that we do proper monitoring and auditing and ensuring that the gains that have been promised are properly delivered.
Obviously, that's massively important, Ben. What do you think are the most important considerations when creating a biodiversity net gain plan?
For someone undertaking development and being subject to BNG and how they would satisfy it.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, in terms of deliverability and making sure they've got the appropriate land rights and all that kind of stuff. It's obviously having the right professional team around you who is able to design and deliver a scheme that's going to be sufficiently robust to deliver the gains you need it to. I think funding will be a real issue. So ensuring that there are funds available for future years to again do the monitoring and maintenance and redelivery in certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And I think having a really good relationship with either your responsible body, which is essentially going to be your regulator in the conservation covenant world, or your local planning authority if you're going down 106, because there will be failures. You're writing a plan in year zero, which, if all goes well, will deliver deliver the improvements in biodiversity over 30 years. And that there will be mistakes in that. There will be problems, and you need to be flexible. You need to sort of have open, sensible dialogue between landowners, funders, and regulators or bodies responsible for overseeing the works to make sure that those changes can be made sensibly without hair triggers on enforcement. The last complete disaster if developers and landowners have injunctions taken against them or are subject to fines and what have you, when actually a slightly more mature, slightly more measured approach to enforcement is needed. So I think having, again, it comes back to collaboration, doesn't it? But really sensible relationships and mature relationships with all parties to make sure that things are delivered, and if they don't work, a different approach is taken collaboratively.
Certainly, yeah. I think that's really important, Ben. Now, almost one of the last questions, and it's kind of a funny one, but given everything that you've talked about in our chat today, if you were to run a training course for your clients specifically for the new law, how would that look?
Lots of pictures. No,
very good.
I think when we do BNG training, we talk a lot about what your strategy is going to be in terms of where you're going to deliver it. Are you going to do it on site or off site? Essentially, if you're doing it off site, how do you do it? If you do it on site, what are the various considerations to make there? And what are the pros and cons of each? And I think that's often quite a surprise. I think a lot of developers just think, oh, we'll do an on-site solution, and actually that's not always going to be the best for nature. So I think that's what our sessions look like.
Now, finally, Ben, I know that you would prefer to have an optimistic answer to this, but what do you think the future of biodiversity net gain in the UK looks like?
I genuinely think it's bright. I think we'll start at 10%. We'll have some ups and downs. There'll be people throwing their toys out the pram saying, oh, I told you it didn't work. But I think overall it will succeed. I think we'll have schemes that go beyond 10%. I think we'll have some that go below. And I think people will realize, actually, this is really good. It makes my development look more attractive. It's great for my ESG credentials. It's really not tricky to do. Everyone knows how we're doing it now, so we might go voluntarily to 15% or 20%, and local authorities will start to put their own local planning supplementary planning policies together and decide that they want to go to 20%, then we might start to see the mandatory numbers ratcheting up. And I think it has the potential to just get better and better and better. And then we'll see people doing similar schemes to biodiversity net gain, but slightly unregulated, and selling those units to corporates and large businesses who are wanting to improve the impact that they have on nature as well. So I think this is the start of something that's going to be really quite successful.
Well, that's excellent to hear you say that. I'm not entirely surprised. And if, I think, as you've mentioned a few times during our chat, Ben, if collaboration is, front and center, I think it does have the potential you've just talked about.
Yeah. Well, let's cross our fingers.
Our thanks to Ben Stansfield for being our guest on this episode of Constructive Voices. And the conversation around biodiversity and the BNG laws have also been covered on some previous episodes. So if you haven't heard those yet, it's worth going back to listen. And that's all for this episode of Constructive Voices. Please take a moment to share it with others who may find it interesting. Follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes automatically on your favourite podcast app, and rate and review the podcast if you can. You can also listen to the latest episode by saying, Alexa, play Constructive Voices podcast.
Here's Constructive Voices. Here's the latest episode.
And on our website, where there's lots more information too. That's constructive-voices.com. Don't forget the dash. Until next time, thanks for listening. You're really helping us build something.